I set the table carefully that evening, polishing the old silver and unfolding the linen I had saved for nights that mattered. A small part of me believed they would notice, that the tradition we once held so tightly might flicker alive again. New Year's Eve was supposed to be about family, wasn't it? A chance to look back together, to remember who we once were. Yet I could feel it even before the clock began ticking louder. Something was off, a silence around me that grew heavier than words. Tell me honestly, have you ever been in a room full of your own family and still felt like a stranger? Their laughter rose without me, circling the table, bouncing off the walls as if I were invisible. I lifted my glass, waiting for a glance, a word, a gesture of recognition. None came, and as the countdown approached, I realized this night would not be about celebration. It would be about a reckoning. I didn't speak right away after that first sting. The glass in my hand felt heavier than it should, as though silence itself had weight. Their laughter, high and careless, passed around the table like a bottle, but I wasn't given a sip. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that maybe they were just caught up in the moment. But deep down, I already knew better. It wasn't a moment. It was a pattern. I stayed seated for a while, smiling when someone glanced in my direction, though they weren't looking for me. It reminded me of the days when I'd sit at the edge of a playground, watching my kids run and tumble, waiting for them to wave. They always used to. Tonight, no one remembered. That wave never came. The food tasted fine, but each bite turned dry in my mouth. The noise around me filled the space, but it didn't fill me. Every so often I caught a word. Job promotions, vacation plans, mortgage payments, conversations that carried no space for me. And maybe that was the part that hurt most. I had once been the center of their planning. Their futures had been shaped by my sacrifices. Now their futures had no room for me at all. I kept running through old years in my mind. The first New Year's after their mother died, when I sat them all down and told them we would carry on together. We didn't just eat, we sang. We lit sparklers in the yard and whispered wishes into the night. The children clung to me not just out of grief, but because they trusted I would hold us steady. And I did. For decades, I did. Now, in the same house with the same walls and windows, I might as well have been an intruder. When the plates were cleared, they moved into the living room, arms linked, phones buzzing with messages from friends and coworkers. I followed slowly, careful not to interrupt, as though stepping into my own living room was an intrusion. They sprawled across the couches, leaving me the corner chair, the one furthest from the fire. No one asked if I wanted a blanket, though they used to shove one onto my lap without asking. It struck me, in that small, sharp way life delivers its lessons, that care has an expiration date in some families. I let my eyes wander to the mantel, where a row of photographs told a different story. There I was, years younger, holding each of them on my shoulders, smiling in matching sweaters, leading the countdowns. The contrast burned more than the wine in my throat. Photographs never change. People do. The television was switched on, the bright glow of a broadcast countdown filling the space with its empty cheer. They shouted numbers at the screen, their voices tangling together. I opened my mouth, then closed it. I realized no one would hear me over the noise, and that was when it began to settle into me like cold air through a crack in the window. This was not just neglect. This was dismissal. They had placed me outside the circle, and I was expected to accept it. I thought about leaving the room, maybe retreating to the kitchen, maybe even to bed. But something stopped me. A heaviness, yes, but also a question. If I walked away, would they even notice? Or would they keep laughing, keep counting, as though nothing had changed? The question rattled around in my chest. I stayed put. I needed to see for myself. As the clock edged closer to midnight, I remembered the times when I had made them promise to look after each other if I was gone. I remembered how their little hands had squeezed mine, full of sincerity only children know. And then I looked at those same hands now, holding champagne flutes, holding phones, holding each other, but not holding me. The countdown grew louder. 10, 9, 8. Their faces glowed in the television light, flushed with youth and laughter. 7, 6. I whispered the numbers under my breath. Unheard. 5, 4, No one looked my way. 3, 2. I thought, just for a heartbeat, that maybe one of them would call my name. 1. They shouted, kissed, clinked glasses. I sat still. That was the exact moment I knew. It wasn't simply that they had forgotten me. It was that they had chosen to forget. And if forgetting me was so easy, then remembering myself was the only thing left for me to do. I kept my smile fixed, though inside it felt like something had already been signed, as if a line had been drawn that none of them noticed but me. I stayed quiet, watching, waiting. It wasn't anger that rose in me. It was a strange calm, like the hush before thunder. That calm carried its own weight, heavier than any outburst could have been. The first toast of the night came soon after. My eldest son stood, glass in hand, raising it high. He spoke about blessings, about how grateful he was for the year behind him, for the opportunities waiting ahead. His voice rang steady, and everyone clapped when he finished. Everyone but me. Not because I wasn't proud, but because I realized something that chilled me more than the winter wind outside. Not once did he mention me. Not once did he acknowledge the roof that sheltered him, or the years of labor that made his education possible. I thought maybe I was being too sensitive. Perhaps another toast would balance the scales. My daughter rose next. She thanked her husband, thanked her siblings, thanked her colleagues, even thanked her friends who couldn't make it that night. Again the applause. Again my silence. By the third toast I knew I wasn't part of their gratitude anymore. It was hard to describe the taste of being forgotten. It was bitter, yes, but not sharp. It was dull, like chewing on paper. It fills your mouth with nothing and still leaves you heavy. I held my glass anyway, raising it slightly out of habit. I touched the rim to my lips but didn't drink. No one noticed. As I sat there, my mind pulled me backward again. I remembered the New Year's when my daughter was 12, trembling with nerves before a school recital. She cried into my chest, saying she couldn't do it. I told her courage wasn't about never being scared. It was about standing up anyway. That night, she stood on stage and sang like her voice belonged to the world. I was the one who had taught her that courage. Yet tonight, she couldn't spare a single word of thanks. The noise around me swelled again. Laughter bouncing, glasses clinking. I caught fragments of conversation. Talks of new cars, of vacation houses, of promotions. Every word was a reminder of how much they had, and how little they valued where it all came from. I wasn't jealous. I wasn't angry. I was simply erased. And still I sat. The television blared a host's cheerful voice, filling in the background. The screen counted down minutes, then seconds. I stared at the glowing numbers, thinking how strange it was that time moved forward no matter how still a person felt inside. Someone asked if more champagne was left. I realized the bottle was empty. I stood, almost relieved to have something to do. In the kitchen, the house felt quieter. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock on the wall. These sounds felt more like company than the people in my living room. I poured a new bottle carefully, listening to the fizz, the bubbles rising and falling. It struck me that even a bottle emptied itself with more grace than my family had shown me that night. I carried the glasses back in, setting them on the table. Hands reached past me, over me, around me, but not one hand reached toward me. For the first time that night, I didn't even pretend to smile. The countdown began in earnest. 10, 9, 8. The room erupted with energy. I sat again, hands folded in my lap. My eyes followed each of them, waiting for the smallest sign. A nod, a glance, a touch. 7, 6, 5. None came. 4, 3. Their voices were all around me, rising, colliding. 2, 1. Cheers. The room erupted. Glasses clinked. Laughter soared. And I still was invisible. That moment, that empty toast, that deliberate silence, is where the final thought took root. Not vengeance. Not spite. Something firmer. The decision to reclaim what was mine before they had taken even my place at my own table. The clock had already struck midnight. But for me, the night hadn't ended. In some ways, it had only just begun. I didn't want to leave my chair. Not yet. My children were still laughing, talking about their resolutions, but I couldn't join in. I wasn't ready to put words into the air while mine were being swallowed by silence. You'd think a parent learns to accept being overlooked as the years go by. Maybe some do, but I couldn't shake the question. If they forgot me so easily tonight, what would tomorrow look like? What about the years ahead? Would I be nothing more than the one who paid the bills, the one who sacrificed, but never the one they acknowledged? That thought hit harder than any unkind word could have. I tried to remind myself of the old saying, respect is earned, not given. I had earned it 100 times over. And yet here I was, watching my own family treat me like a chair in the corner. They didn't curse me, they didn't fight me. They simply ignored me. Somehow that hurt worse. When the laughter died down and the first wave of sleepiness set in, they began drifting toward the guest rooms. My eldest son patted me on the shoulder on his way past, not stopping long enough for a real conversation. My daughter kissed me on the cheek quickly, already distracted by her phone buzzing in her hand. The younger ones waved, half-hearted, before disappearing down the hallway. The house grew quiet again. I stayed in the living room, staring at the empty glasses and half-eaten food. The decorations seemed foolish now, strings of lights blinking for no one. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence fill the spaces their voices had left behind. It was then, in that stillness, that another memory came. Years earlier, after my wife passed, I promised myself I would keep the family together. I hosted dinners, saved every scrap to make sure birthdays felt whole. Even when grief split us wide open, I stood firm when everything else wavered. And yet tonight, the very people I held together had no space for me in their circle of joy. I asked myself a hard question. Had I made a mistake by giving too much? Parents tell themselves they're investing in their children, but sometimes it's less investment and more surrender. I had given until there was almost nothing left of me. And what had it bought? An empty toast, a hollow new year, a seat that no one cared to fill. I rose slowly and began clearing the table. Each plate clinked against the sink like a reminder. The food I prepared, the hours I spent, the countless times I set aside my needs for theirs. My back ached, my hands trembled, but I worked through it anyway. Old habits, the ones built on service, are hard to break. But somewhere between stacking plates and rinsing glasses, I made a quiet decision. I wasn't going to continue this pattern. They had written me out of their celebrations, their gratitude, their lives. If that's the path they chose, then I would take mine. And my path would not be the one where I kept standing behind them, hoping for scraps of acknowledgement. I walked back into the living room, stood in front of the darkened television, and whispered to myself, this year is mine. It wasn't about punishing them. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the dignity that had been slipping through my fingers without me noticing. I wasn't just a father or a provider. I was a person, one who deserved more than to be treated like furniture in the background of their happiness. The decision didn't erase the hurt, but it did give me strength. I thought about the notarized letter tucked away in my desk drawer, the one I had written months ago after seeing small signs that this day might come. I thought about the quiet meetings with the lawyer, the careful steps I had taken to make sure no one could twist my intentions later. I hadn't wanted to use it. I had hoped they'd prove me wrong. But tonight they proved me right. By the time I went to bed, the house was silent. I looked in on each of them, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the shift that had already taken place in my mind. They would wake up tomorrow thinking nothing had changed. They'd laugh over breakfast, make plans for the year, and carry on as if the night before had been perfect. But I knew better. The line had been drawn, and I had finally stepped over it. This wasn't the ending of something. It was the beginning. Morning light streamed through the curtains, softer than I expected after such a long night. For a moment, I let myself sit quietly in the stillness, not rushing to wake anyone, not rushing to perform the duties I had taken on for so many years. It struck me then. This pause, this silence, felt like the first real breath I had taken in decades. As I stood at the window, watching the frost melt off the grass, my thoughts wandered back to the countless mornings I had started the day early for them. I used to fry eggs, toast bread, pack lunches, even when I was dead tired from working late shifts. I never thought of it as sacrifice. I thought of it as love. But what happens when love feels one-sided? What happens when the very people you gave everything to forget you at the table of gratitude? That was the question circling in my mind. I couldn't erase last night. Their silence, their laughter that flowed around me but not toward me, had carved itself deep. And yet, as I stood there, I realized the night had also given me clarity. I wasn't going to chase acknowledgement anymore. My worth wasn't theirs to measure, not anymore. The house was still quiet, my children sleeping off their celebrations. I walked to my study, opened the drawer, and pulled out the envelope I had sealed weeks ago. It wasn't dramatic looking, just a plain white envelope with a lawyer's stamp in the corner. But inside it was every decision I had made in preparation for this moment. I sat at the desk and ran my hand over it. The papers inside carried the weight of years of work, the years of building a home, saving what little I could, protecting every asset so it wouldn't crumble. And now I had placed it in writing, who would receive what, under what conditions, and who would no longer have free rein to take without respect. It wasn't about cutting them off completely. I wasn't cruel. But it was about balance. About teaching them, maybe too late, that nothing in this life is guaranteed, not even a parent's endless giving. I remembered the lawyer's words when I first explained my situation. You're not punishing them. You're protecting yourself. And that's something every person has the right to do. At the time, I'd nodded without fully believing it. But today, standing at this crossroads, I knew he had been right. When the house finally stirred and footsteps padded down the hallway, I didn't rush to put the envelope away. I left it on the desk, visible, almost daring one of them to notice. My eldest son came in first, rubbing his eyes, heading straight for the coffee pot. He glanced toward me but didn't say much more than, "Morning, Dad." The envelope sat inches from his elbow, but he never looked down. It was almost symbolic, the way they overlooked even what was right in front of them. Later, my daughter came in, scrolling on her phone as she sat at the table. She asked if I wanted her to reheat leftovers for breakfast. The offer was casual, but it was the first time in a long while she had asked me anything at all. I simply said no and watched her thumb keep moving across the glass of her screen. The day passed in fragments, but underneath it all, I felt a shift inside myself. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't begging for them to see me. I was calm, and that calm came from knowing I had already taken action. In the afternoon, while they were out running errands, I took the envelope and drove it to the bank. The safe deposit box clinked as it closed, a final sound that told me the decision was sealed. Not in anger, but in quiet determination. On the drive back, I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time in years, I didn't look like someone waiting for approval. I looked like a man reclaiming his place in his own story. That evening, when we gathered again, I joined them. Not to be validated, but simply to be present on my own terms. Their conversations ran the same way, light, scattered, shallow. I didn't interrupt, but I didn't sit invisible either. I laughed when something was funny, I added a comment when it mattered to me, and I didn't apologize for the silence that came in between. The truth was they hadn't changed, but I had, and sometimes that's the only change that matters. I knew challenges lay ahead. They'd find out soon enough that my decisions carried weight. There would be questions, arguments, maybe even anger, but none of that scared me anymore. Last night had been my breaking point. Today was my rebuilding. This wasn't about ending family ties, it was about resetting them. And whether they accepted it or not, I had finally drawn a line that couldn't be erased. The peace I carried from the bank didn't last long. It never does when others begin to notice a shift they can't name. That evening, while clearing dishes, I saw my eldest glance again at the study desk. The envelope was gone, and though he didn't say a word, I caught the flicker in his eyes. That restless look children give when they know something has moved without their permission. It wasn't the envelope itself he missed. It was the control he assumed he had over me. Later, while I sat in the armchair, the air grew heavier. Conversations that should have felt casual were laced with sharper pauses. My daughter asked where I had been earlier in the day, her tone light but her eyes sharper than her voice. I simply told her I had errands. She didn't push, but I knew the question wasn't about errands at all. The truth was edging closer to the surface, and I could feel it in the way they lingered in the kitchen, whispering in low tones when they thought I was out of earshot. For years, I had been predictable. They knew my habits, my movements, even the way I folded the bills before placing them in the old tin box on the shelf. But something in me had broken on New Year's Eve, and now my unpredictability unsettled them more than my silence ever had. The days that followed turned into a quiet game of observation. I watched them and they watched me. My son began checking the mailbox as if expecting some clue to arrive. My daughter started rummaging in drawers more often, pretending to look for tape or pens. They were searching for answers I had already locked away. It would have been easier to sit them down, to tell them everything plainly. But that would have ruined the lesson. Words had never been enough between us. Not when they were younger, not now. They needed to see the consequences of overlooking someone who had carried them all their lives. One afternoon, I overheard my son on the phone. His voice was low, agitated, almost desperate. I couldn't catch every word, but I heard enough. Dad's acting strange. Documents. Lawyer. Can't let this slip. That confirmed it. They were worried. Not about me, but about what they might lose. I didn't confront him. Instead, I carried on with my routine, making coffee, paying bills, watering the plants. But inside, I felt the tension growing. A string pulled tighter each day, ready to snap. The real test came on a Sunday evening. We were gathered in the living room, the television buzzing with a show no one was watching. My daughter suddenly turned to me and asked, "Dad, do you still plan to leave the house to us?" The room went silent. Even the television noise faded into the background. Her question wasn't clumsy. It was deliberate, bold, sharpened by days of whispering. I looked at her, then at my son. His jaw tightened as if bracing for my answer. For the first time in years, I let the silence stretch without rushing to fill it. They shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, realizing I wasn't going to give the automatic reassurance they expected. Finally, I said, "What I leave behind will depend on what's deserved, not what's assumed." Their faces stiffened. The old balance of power had shifted with a single sentence. And though my voice was calm, the weight of those words filled the room heavier than any argument could. I rose from my chair and went to the kitchen, leaving them behind in their unease. My hands shook slightly as I poured water into a glass, but not from fear, from the release of finally saying aloud what had lived in silence inside me for too long. I knew then the days ahead would not be quiet. They would question more, perhaps even demand answers. And eventually, they would discover the truth of what I had already set in motion. But for the first time, I wasn't the one afraid of confrontation. They were, and that was enough to carry me through the night. It's strange how quickly silence can turn into suspicion. For weeks, they had tiptoed around me, dropping hints, watching my movements. But that Sunday question at the table broke something in the air. After that, it was no longer subtle. It was direct, heavy, and unavoidable. I could see it in the way my son followed me into the study one evening, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, pretending he had come in by chance. "Dad," he said, "we need to talk about the house." There it was. The thing they had been circling, the truth they wanted to pry open. I stayed seated, pen in hand, as if finishing my notes mattered more than his words. It gave me a moment to breathe, to decide how much of myself I was ready to give away. Finally, I looked up and asked, "What about it?" He shifted, caught between authority and uncertainty. We just need to know what your plans are. Me and my sister have been worried. You've been different. Different. That word hung in the air like an accusation. I told him the truth, but not the one he expected. "I've been thinking, that's all." He frowned. "Thinking about what?" I closed the notebook. "About what's fair. About what's deserved." The silence that followed was sharper than shouting. He looked at me as if I had spoken in another language. For years, he had assumed everything would fall into his lap. My words forced him to face a reality he had never considered, that nothing was guaranteed. Later that night, my daughter confronted me in her own way. Not with questions, but with charm. She sat by my side on the couch, asked if I wanted tea, laughed at jokes she normally wouldn't bother with. Her sudden warmth was almost harder to bear than my son's bluntness. When I didn't respond as she hoped, her mask slipped. "You're hiding something, Dad?" she said softly, not looking at me. "I just wish you trusted us enough to tell us." I wanted to laugh. Trusted them? The same children who left me invisible on New Year's Eve? The same voices that rose around me as if I wasn't there? Trust had been chipped away long before these papers were signed. But I didn't laugh. I simply said, "There are things you'll understand in time." Her eyes narrowed, not in sadness but in calculation. She wanted answers, not comfort. In the days that followed, their patience ran thinner. My son grew short-tempered, asking about the bills, the bank, even the neighbors. My daughter hovered when the mail arrived, as if a single envelope might betray me. They weren't protecting me. They were guarding their stake. And yet, through all of this, I felt strangely calm. I had spent years bending to their moods, hoping for scraps of kindness, for recognition that rarely came. Now, for once, it was them bending toward me, circling like restless birds around a branch they feared might snap. One evening, my son finally raised his voice. "Dad, this isn't fair. You can't just change everything without telling us. We're your family." That word again, family. It was thrown like a shield, but it felt hollow. I looked at him steadily. Family notices when you're in the room. Family doesn't wait until New Year's Eve to remember you exist. His face flushed, and for a moment he had no reply. My daughter tried to fill the silence, but her voice shook. "We were celebrating. You're overreacting." Overreacting. I let the word roll in my mind. Perhaps once I would have believed it, but not anymore. I leaned back, my voice low but firm. "What you call celebration, I call neglect. And I won't ignore it any longer." The room grew quiet. They exchanged looks, searching for a strategy, a response, a way to pull me back into the place I had occupied for years. Silent, compliant, predictable. But that man was gone. I didn't tell them about the eviction papers, not yet. I let them sit in the tension, in the awareness that something had shifted beyond their control. Let them wonder, let them fear. Because for the first time, they were the ones left in the dark. It's a strange thing, watching your own children move as if they're plotting against you. There was no single argument, no slammed doors, no one moment where the line was crossed. Instead, it built like a storm behind their eyes, each word sharper, each silence heavier. I could feel them circling me, but not out of love. They wanted answers. They wanted certainty. They wanted control. And deep down, I knew a reckoning was coming. It began one Thursday evening. I was in the living room, the television humming in the background, when they arrived together. That alone told me everything. They rarely agreed on anything, but on this night, they walked in like partners. Not siblings, not children, but allies in a battle I hadn't agreed to fight. My son stood by the mantel, restless, tapping his fingers against the wood. My daughter chose the armchair, posture straight, voice calm in the way people sound when they've rehearsed their lines. "Dad," she started, "we can't keep avoiding this." I didn't reply. I let her words hang, curious how long it would take before patience cracked. She glanced at her brother, who jumped in. "We need to know what you're planning with the house. With everything, really. You've been making choices without us." The phrasing caught me. Without us. As if my life was a shared project they had ownership over. As if the home I built, the roof I paid for, somehow belonged to them by default. I folded my hands and asked quietly, "What makes you think it's yours to decide?" Their silence was quick, but it wasn't surprise. It was irritation. They had expected resistance, but not in that form. My daughter leaned forward. "We're your family. We have a right to know." That word again, right? I could almost laugh at how easily they wore it, how confidently they assumed it applied. I said, "You had a right to sit with me on New Year's Eve. You had a right to ask how I was when I sat alone in that corner. Where was that right then? Her eyes flickered, but she didn't answer. My son did. You're twisting this. We were celebrating. You're holding grudges instead of being practical. Practical. That was his weapon. Reduce me to numbers, to property, to paperwork. If feelings couldn't be denied, they could be minimized. I leaned back, keeping my voice steady. I'm not holding grudges. I'm holding memories, and they matter more than you think. The room tightened after that. They weren't expecting philosophy. They wanted signatures. Finally, my daughter's tone changed. She stopped pretending, dropped the warmth, and let the sharpness out. Dad, are you cutting us out? Just say it. Are you leaving everything to someone else? It was the question they had been circling for weeks. The thing they didn't want to say out loud until desperation pushed them. I met her eyes and, for a moment, considered the truth. But the truth was not ready yet. Timing mattered. Pressure needed to build until it cracked open on its own. So I told her the one thing that would keep the fire alive. You'll know when the time comes. Her face tightened. My son muttered something under his breath, pacing the floor. They wanted answers, but I handed them silence. And silence, I realized, was more powerful than anything I could have explained. After they left that night, I sat in the same room, letting the quiet settle. They thought they were closing in on me, but really, it was the opposite. Every step they took revealed more of who they were: impatient, entitled, hungry. What they didn't realize was that the papers were already in order. Their names were already gone. The decision had been made long before they decided to care about me. But I wasn't going to reveal that yet. No, they had to live with the uncertainty, the way I had lived with their indifference. Because sometimes the waiting hurts more than the blow, and I wanted them to feel every second of it. I used to think silence was my greatest weapon, but holding on to silence too long changes a person. It builds a wall inside you, and sooner or later someone has to break through. My children thought they were chipping away at me, wearing me down. What they didn't realize was that the decision had already been carved in stone, and all I had left to do was open the door and let them see it. The chance came sooner than expected. One afternoon, I found them both at my kitchen table. They hadn't called, hadn't knocked politely, just let themselves in with the spare key I'd given them years ago. They sat there with notebooks, pens, and a printout of something that looked suspiciously like a checklist. They looked like accountants going over numbers that didn't belong to them. I walked in, set down my bag, and asked, "Making plans?" Neither of them answered right away. My daughter straightened her papers, pretending to buy time. My son cleared his throat and said, "Dad, we've been thinking. It's not good for you to manage all this on your own. We can take responsibility for the property. Make sure everything is handled correctly." Handled correctly. The arrogance of it nearly made me laugh. Instead, I sat across from them, folding my hands the way my father used to when he knew he had the upper hand. Handled correctly by whose standards? I asked. My daughter looked me in the eye, and for the first time she didn't flinch. By ours. We're not children anymore. We can protect what's here better than you can. It's time to pass things on. Her phrasing told me everything. It wasn't about protecting me. It was about securing themselves. I let the silence stretch, then stood up slowly and went to the cabinet by the wall. They watched, probably thinking I was reaching for coffee or tea, something to keep the conversation civilized. Instead, I pulled out the envelope I had been keeping for weeks. Thick, sealed, official. I set it down on the table between us. "This," I said, tapping the edge, "is the reality you've been circling. Since you're both so eager to manage what's mine, maybe it's time you saw what's already been decided." My son frowned, reaching for it, but I pulled it back slightly. "Not so fast. You'll read it here in front of me. No whispers, no schemes. Every word out loud." My daughter hesitated, then slid the envelope open. Her hands trembled more than she wanted to admit. She unfolded the documents and started reading. Her voice wavered on the first line. This is a transfer of deed." My son leaned over, scanning the page. His face reddened as he reached the crucial part. "You gave it away. Not to us. To who is this? To a foundation." I nodded, calm as the storm built in their voices. Yes, the house will go to the community trust when I'm gone. It will become a space for people who need it more than either of you. People who won't treat it as a prize, but as a home. The room went silent except for the shuffle of paper. My daughter's hands clenched. Her lips pressed tight as if she could swallow the words she wanted to spit out. My son wasn't so restrained. He slammed his fist against the table. You're cutting us out. After everything we've done. I raised my voice, firm but steady. Everything you've done? You mean the empty seats at birthdays? The excuses when I asked for company? The way you treated me like a burden instead of a father? That's what you're holding up as proof you deserve this place. The question hit harder than I expected. They didn't have answers, only anger. My daughter finally said, "You're punishing us." I shook my head. No, I'm teaching you. Love is not an inheritance. Respect is not an entitlement. If you want something, you earn it. You don't wait until a person is too tired to fight back. The air in the room grew thick. My son shoved back his chair, pacing like a caged animal. "This is a betrayal," he muttered. I stood as well, not to tower over them, but to stand level, eye to eye. "No. Betrayal is watching your father grow old and pretending he doesn't notice when you drift away. Betrayal is remembering me when it's convenient, but forgetting me when it matters. What I've done here is not betrayal. It's justice." They didn't want to hear that, but it didn't matter anymore. I picked up the papers and slid them back into the envelope. "Now you know. It's final. Nothing you say or do will change it." My daughter's face crumpled, though she tried to hide it. My son opened his mouth, then closed it again, words drying up before they formed. For the first time in years I felt taller, lighter. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't holding back. The decision was out in the open, and the weight had shifted off me and onto them. I walked them to the door. Neither protested. They left without slamming it, which was almost worse than if they had. Silence followed them out, echoing through the rooms that suddenly felt more like mine than ever. I stood in the doorway long after they were gone, breathing in the cool air. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I had reclaimed something. Not just the house, myself. The night after they left, I didn't sleep. The house felt both mine and not mine, like I had just claimed it but was still waiting for someone to barge in and take it away. I kept walking from room to room, touching the door frames, running my hand across the dining table, standing at the window like a guard on watch. It wasn't fear that kept me awake. It was the knowledge that this wasn't finished. I knew my children too well. They weren't going to accept what they had heard in that kitchen. They would come back, maybe softer, maybe louder, but they would come. And they did. 3 days later, I heard the knock. Not the usual impatient rattle of keys in the lock, but an actual knock. It almost disarmed me. I opened the door to find both of them standing there, notebooks gone, hands empty, faces rehearsed into something that looked like humility. My daughter spoke first. "Dad, can we talk?" I let them in, not because I owed them, but because the house was still mine and I decided who crossed its threshold. They sat at the table again, but this time they didn't spread papers across it. They just sat, waiting for me to take the lead. I stayed standing. "Go ahead," I said. My son leaned forward, elbows on the table. "We were angry. We said things we didn't mean. But think about what you're doing. Giving the house to strangers? A foundation? That doesn't honor Mom. Doesn't honor us. This is our family home." His words were smoother now, polished, but the edges of entitlement still showed. I shook my head. "Your mother would have wanted the home to be lived in, not fought over like a prize. She would have wanted peace, not papers and arguments." My daughter jumped in quickly. "Then let us prove ourselves. Give us a chance to show you we can take care of this place. Don't lock us out forever." There it was, the plea I had been waiting for. I pulled out a chair and finally Saturday. "Do you think it's just about the property? Do you really believe all this anger, all this distance, came from the walls around us? No. Came from how you treated me. From how you treated each other. If I hand you these keys, nothing changes. The house doesn't heal wounds. People do. My son opened his mouth to argue, but I raised my hand. I'm not done. The silence pressed heavy as I spoke again. You want to show me something? Then show me without expecting anything in return. Show me by being present, not by waiting for me to die so you can inherit. That landed. I could see it in their eyes. My daughter dropped her gaze to the table, chewing on her lip. My son leaned back, crossing his arms, though the fight in him was dimmer now. I continued, softer. You're not too late. You still have time to rebuild, but not if every word out of your mouths is about deeds and wills. I want children who stand beside me, not behind me, pushing me toward the end so they can collect what's left. No one spoke for a long time. The quiet was uncomfortable but honest. Finally, my daughter whispered, "What do we do then?" It wasn't a trap. It was the first real question she had asked me in years. I said, "Start by being here because you want to, not because you want something. Come for dinner. Sit in the living room. Tell me about your lives, even the parts that aren't polished. Let me know you as people again, not as heirs." She nodded slowly. My son, still guarded, muttered, "And if we do that?" I looked him in the eye. "Then maybe we find a way back to each other. But the papers stay where they are. That part is settled." It was the first time I saw him hesitate. Not in anger, but in thought. He wasn't ready to accept it, but the seed was there. They left soon after, quieter than before. No slamming, no accusations. Just the weight of reality following them out the door. That night, I sat alone at the table and breathed easier. For the first time, I felt they might actually see me, not as a gatekeeper to an inheritance, but as a man still alive, still worthy of love, still standing on his own terms. I wasn't naive. I knew there would be setbacks, maybe more arguments. But I also knew something had shifted. Not in the papers, not in the deed, but in us. And for the first time, I believed it might be enough. I thought the silence after that night would bring me peace. But it didn't. The quiet that settled in the house felt heavier than the arguments ever did. Papers were signed, accounts were settled, and the letter had done what it needed to do. Yet I could feel the space between us growing wider. It was no longer about money or property. It was about trust, about whether the people who once promised to carry each other could ever repair what they had broken. The next morning, I found myself staring at the kitchen table, the one that had carried every family meal for decades. Scratches ran across its surface from children's toys, hot pans, and elbows resting during long talks. That table knew more about our family than anyone alive. But now it looked like a crime scene. I sat there alone, thinking of all the laughter that used to echo in this room. I wondered if it would ever return. It's strange how, after the truth is exposed, you think it should bring closure. Instead, it often cracks open even deeper questions. Yes, I had proof. Yes, I protected what was mine. But in winning, I lost something too, something far less replaceable. That evening, a message arrived on my phone. It wasn't long, just a single sentence from one of them. "We need to talk." My first instinct was to delete it. Haven't we said enough? Haven't we drawn enough blood? But there's always that part of a parent that hopes the fight can end, that maybe there's still a path back to family instead of permanent strangers. I agreed to meet. We sat in a cafe, the kind of neutral place people choose when they're afraid of being trapped. They ordered coffee they didn't drink, and I folded my hands, waiting. They started with an apology, not the kind that smooths everything over, but the kind where you can tell it hurts to say the words out loud. "I didn't know how to let go," they admitted. "I thought I was entitled, and when I saw it slipping away, I fought dirty. I wanted to snap back. I wanted to remind them of every sleepless night, every insult, every cold shoulder. But I just sat there. Maybe I was too tired. Maybe I wanted to see if silence could carry more weight than anger. They kept talking, stumbling through the mess of excuses and explanations, until the truth slipped out. It wasn't about the jewelry, the car, or the deed. It was about feeling left out, about believing they weren't loved as much as the others. That hit me harder than any accusation ever could. Because if that's what they believed, then where did I go wrong? I walked home with their words echoing in my mind. Love had never been divided in my eyes, it was constant, steady, given freely. But somewhere along the way it hadn't been felt that way. And maybe that was the real wound. The letter proved ownership. The camera proved honesty. But nothing could prove love to someone who had convinced themselves it wasn't there. For days I wrestled with that thought. Was my victory hollow if my family was broken beyond repair? I kept replaying moments in my head. Christmas mornings, graduations, even the long nights in hospitals when we held each other together. Those memories were real. But memory doesn't always carry the same weight for everyone. Some remember only what they lacked. One afternoon, I decided to stop waiting for time to heal it. I gathered them again, this time in my own living room. Not for another fight, not for another legal paper, but for something different. I laid the will on the table, the same table that had carried every memory, and I said, "This is settled. The law is clear. But if we can't talk about what's underneath all of this, then we've already lost more than any paper could take away." There was resistance at first, defensive glances, crossed arms, muttered words. But slowly stories began to spill out. Grievances from years ago, slights that seemed small to me but had grown into walls for them. It wasn't easy to listen. Some of it felt unfair, twisted by perspective, but I kept quiet and let them say what needed to be said. By the end of the night, no one had forgiven anyone fully, but something shifted. The shouting was gone. In its place was exhaustion, yes, but also a small crack in the wall. For the first time in months, maybe years, we weren't enemies. We were just people sitting in the same room, trying to find our way back. I don't pretend everything was solved. Far from it. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight. But the decision I made then was simple. I would stop fighting battles over possessions and start fighting for the chance that my family might one day heal. Even if they walked away, even if they never returned fully, I wanted them to remember that I never stopped being their parent. Some nights, I still wake up wondering if I made the right choices. Did defending myself cost me too much? Or did drawing that line in the sand finally force the truth into the open? I don't have a clear answer. But I do know this. A family built only on unspoken resentment is weaker than one tested by open conflict. And as I sit here now, that old kitchen table scarred but still standing between us, I realize maybe that's the point. Families don't remain whole because nothing ever breaks them. They remain whole because, even when broken, someone decides it's worth trying to mend. After that gathering in my living room, I thought we had reached a fragile truce. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was a pause in the fighting. Days passed without another message demanding proof, without another argument about who deserved what. But the silence carried something else with it. An uneasiness, like standing on a frozen pond not knowing if the ice will hold. Every time my phone buzzed, I wondered if it was the beginning of another storm. Would they come back with new claims? Would another hidden resentment find its way into the open? I caught myself tensing up, as though bracing for impact. One afternoon, I sat with a photo album in my lap, flipping through the years that felt so distant now. Weddings, birthdays, family trips. Moments we had once sworn would never fade. Yet here we were, clinging to scraps of trust, unsure if the bond was strong enough to survive. The pictures looked almost dishonest to me. Smiles frozen in time, hiding all the fractures that were already there but invisible then. It made me question whether the peace we had found now was real or just another photograph waiting to crack. I decided that if this truce was going to last, it needed more than silence. It needed deliberate effort, a choice to keep showing up even when the air was thick with history. So I invited them for dinner. Not everyone said yes, but enough did to make the table feel alive again. The evening began awkwardly. The table that once carried effortless chatter now carried hesitation. Forks scraped plates louder than voices. I had to push through the weight in the room, so I asked them about their work, their kids, small things that had nothing to do with money or property. Slowly, the tension began to loosen. A laugh slipped out here, a story found its way there. For the first time in months, the house didn't feel like a battlefield. But just when I thought we had turned a corner, an old scar reopened. One of them leaned back, eyes fixed on me, and said, I still don't understand why you didn't trust us enough to tell us about the letter earlier. The room froze. Forks stopped moving. Every gaze shifted toward me. My chest tightened. I could have explained that I was trying to avoid exactly this. Fights, suspicion, bitterness. But I realized in that moment that withholding the letter had become its own wound. It didn't matter that I had been right. What mattered was that, in their eyes, I had chosen secrecy over openness. I answered carefully, I wasn't protecting the paper. I was protecting myself from losing you. For a second, no one spoke. Then, one of them nodded, not in full agreement, but in recognition of something they hadn't considered. The conversation didn't explode into shouting. Instead, it settled into an uneasy honesty. That honesty hurt, but at least it was real. Later that night, after they left, I walked back to the table and ran my hand over the scratches again. Those marks had always bothered me before, but now I saw them differently. They weren't flaws. They were reminders of life lived, of family meals where chaos and love sat side by side. Maybe that's what we were now. Scratched, uneven, but still standing. The weeks that followed weren't perfect. There were still tense phone calls, still moments when someone pulled away. But there were also visits that didn't end in shouting, birthdays that felt almost normal, and conversations that went beyond money. Healing wasn't a single event. It was a series of choices made over and over again, sometimes clumsy, sometimes reluctant, but choices all the same. I began to notice that the more we talked about the things that had hurt us, the lighter the air became. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about admitting it had happened and deciding what to do with it. Each story told, each grievance acknowledged, chipped away at the distance we had built. Still, I couldn't shake the lingering question. Would they ever forgive me completely for keeping the letter secret? Or would that always sit like a shadow between us? That question hung in the air like smoke. It was during one quiet evening, when one of them came over unannounced, that I found an answer of sorts. They didn't come to argue. They came to sit, to share tea, to talk about nothing in particular. As they were leaving, they paused at the door and said, I'm starting to understand why you did what you did. I don't like it, but I get it. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was the beginning of understanding, and maybe that was enough for now. Yet even with these small steps forward, I knew one thing clearly. This chapter in our family's story would never fully close. Betrayal leaves its fingerprints. No matter how much we sweep, some traces remain. But maybe that's not entirely a curse. Maybe those traces are what remind us not to repeat the same mistakes, not to let silence replace honesty again. Looking back, I don't regret defending myself. I regret that it ever came to that point. But perhaps in the ashes of that conflict, something new is being built. Something not as glossy as the photographs in the album, but more durable, more real. And as I sit here now, the house quieter than it used to be but not as lonely as I feared, I realize that survival sometimes looks like this. A scarred table, fractured trust slowly mending, and the stubborn hope that family, despite everything, is still worth fighting for. I thought the storm had passed, yet peace felt more like a fragile guest than a permanent resident. There were still evenings when my mind replayed the arguments word for word, each phrase sharp as broken glass. I wanted to believe we were moving forward, but doubt sat heavy, whispering that any step could send us back into chaos. The thing about family is that even when you survive betrayal, you don't simply erase it. It lingers in conversations, in pauses, in the way someone's eyes flicker before they answer. You can forgive, you can patch, but you cannot make it vanish. I wrestled with this truth for weeks, wondering if peace built on cracks could hold. One morning, while sorting through papers in the drawer where I had once hidden the notarized letter, I found something else I had nearly forgotten. A handwritten note from years ago, penned during a holiday gathering. It wasn't formal or binding, just a few lines about how grateful my children were for the life we had built together. Seeing it again stopped me. They had once been united in gratitude, before money and property carved us into sides. That reminder pierced through the cynicism I'd carried like armor. So I did something I hadn't done since all of this began. I called a family meeting not to argue, not to prove, but to remember. When they arrived, I placed the note in the middle of the table. No legal stamps, no signatures, no claims, just their own words from the past. First, no one spoke. Then one of them read it out loud, voice wavering as if unsure whether to trust the memory. Silence followed, but it wasn't hostile. It was heavy, yes, but also thoughtful. For once, no one was calculating what they stood to gain. They were simply remembering a time when we were on the same side. That moment could have gone either way. Someone could have dismissed it, laughed it off as childish sentiment. But instead, one of them whispered, "We really lost ourselves, didn't we?" The words cracked something open. For the first time, it wasn't me pointing out the damage. It was them. What followed wasn't a miracle of forgiveness. It wasn't a dramatic embrace or a sudden return to harmony. It was quieter, more tentative. Each of them admitted, in their own way, that the fight had taken more from us than any inheritance could ever give. They didn't absolve me for keeping the letter hidden, but they began to see that the wound wasn't only mine to explain. In the days after, I noticed a shift. Calls became more frequent, not because of conflict but because of habit. They asked how I was, not what I had. Conversations stretched longer, as though we were relearning how to be a family without always circling back to the same wound. Still, I couldn't shake the question of whether we had truly healed or if we were only learning to live with the scar. Perhaps healing isn't about erasing pain but about carrying it without letting it dictate every step. Maybe it's not about forgetting the betrayal but about refusing to let it write the last page. I began to notice small, almost invisible gestures that told me something had shifted. A text message with no agenda. A visit where we sat in comfortable silence. An apology that didn't sound polished but sounded sincere. These weren't grand gestures, but they mattered more than any declaration of peace could. One afternoon, sitting alone with my tea, I realized that the fight over the will had stolen something irreplaceable. Yes, but it had also forced us to confront truths we might have otherwise buried forever. Without that confrontation, we would have lived in photographs, smiling while resentment brewed underneath. Now, at least everything was in the open, and maybe that's what family is. Not flawless, not free from betrayal, but raw, exposed, and still trying. I've stopped waiting for the moment where everything feels like it once did. That time won't return. But what we're building now might be sturdier, precisely because it isn't pretending to be perfect. When I think back on it all, the notarized letter, the accusations, the silence, the hesitant steps toward reconciliation, I realize that survival was never just about proving who was right. It was about refusing to let anger be the only language we spoke. So when people ask me now how things are with my family, I don't say we're healed. I say we're still here. And sometimes, after everything, that's the most powerful truth of all. There's a strange quiet that follows long battles. A silence that doesn't feel like peace but rather like the air after a storm, heavy and unsettled. I kept waiting for the final sign that everything was behind us, but instead what I found was something different. A life that had to keep moving, even with the scars visible to everyone who cared to look. I realized one morning, as I folded laundry and set it on the bed, that healing doesn't arrive as a single day on the calendar. It slips in slowly, unnoticed at first, showing itself in the way you stop bracing for arguments, in the way conversations stretch a little longer without circling back to blame. It's not dramatic. It's steady, and it almost hides in routine. But routine was the very thing I had once feared. Days filled with silence, with no one remembering the person who kept the family together. That fear had once pushed me to fight, to pull out letters, to demand recognition. Now I found myself embracing it. Routine gave me the chance to breathe, to shape a life that wasn't defined by anyone's demands. That shift didn't happen in a vacuum. It came from small choices, like saying yes when neighbors invited me to join them for tea, or letting myself laugh at a story I wasn't sure I'd find funny. These weren't replacements for family, but reminders that I was still part of a world larger than the four walls of conflict. And maybe that was what I had forgotten during those long nights of waiting at the table. Life continues whether or not your children see you. One evening, I sat outside watching the streetlights flicker on, and I thought about how much of my energy had been spent trying to preserve a version of family that no longer existed. The truth was, they were adults with their own lives, their own choices and their own regrets. I could keep chasing after the version of them I once knew, or I could accept them as they were, even if that meant less closeness than I had hoped for. Of course, acceptance didn't mean certainty. There were still fragile moments when a careless word reopened old wounds. I remember one dinner when one of them made a passing comment about money, just a joke, but I felt the room stiffen. No one wanted to go back to the battlefield, but the memory of it was always there, waiting. Would this be the spark that set us off again? We sat in uneasy silence for a moment before someone changed the subject, and the tension slipped away. But it was a reminder. Reconciliation isn't permanent, it's a daily decision. That decision weighed heavily at times. Part of me wanted to throw up my hands and say, "We've been through enough, let's just stop trying." But another part of me, the part that had set the table on that first night of betrayal, still longed for connection. Not the picture-perfect version, but the kind where you can look at one another and say, "We're still here, even if it's messy." As the weeks turned into months, I found myself thinking less about the inheritance and more about legacy. Not what I would leave in documents or deeds, but what would remain in memories, in the way my children spoke about me when I was no longer around. Would they remember the arguments, or the years of laughter before them? Would they carry forward bitterness, or would they one day tell their own children about the strength it took to stand firm? That thought didn't fill me with despair the way it once might have. Instead, it challenged me. If I couldn't control every detail of how the story would be told, I could at least make sure that the part one lived still held dignity. I could live each day in a way that reminded them, and myself, that I was more than the sum of our conflicts. So when the next holiday came around, I did something unexpected. I invited them, not with the hope of recreating the past, but simply to share a meal, nothing more. I set out the plates, not the silver this time, just everyday dishes. No speeches, no letters, no attempts at reminders. Just food and chairs. They came hesitant but willing. We ate, we talked, we cleared the table together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. After they left, I sat in the quiet house and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not triumph, not defeat, just a steady sense of having survived. And maybe survival, in the end, was its own kind of victory. The hardest part of living after betrayal isn't the fights themselves. It's the quiet gaps that follow. People think conflict ends when the shouting stops, when papers are signed, when apologies are mumbled. But what I've learned is that silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes silence is only the space where questions echo louder than before. There were mornings I woke up and wondered if I had done the right thing by holding my ground. Standing firm gave me dignity, but it also left me with distance. That distance was like a room in the house I no longer opened, because stepping inside meant remembering the laughter that used to fill it. I kept circling back to that thought. Did I win something by protecting my rights, or had I lost something greater by breaking the bond that once defined us? That question didn't have a clean answer. And maybe that was the real test, not finding certainty but learning to live in the blur of it. So I started looking for small anchors that reminded me I wasn't drifting alone. A neighbor's wave, call from an old friend, a child's laugh from the street outside. They didn't replace what was missing, but they reminded me that connection was still possible, even if not from where I once expected it. I found myself talking more openly with people I never thought I'd confide in. A woman at the market who once seemed like nothing more than a passing face became someone I looked forward to seeing. We shared stories, both of us carrying our own scars, and there was comfort in that exchange. I realized something then. Family isn't always defined by blood. Sometimes it's the people who notice your absence without needing to be told why. Still, there were reminders of the old wounds that would not disappear. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. For a brief moment, I thought it was another legal notice, another challenge to the choices I'd made. My chest tightened as I tore it open, only to find a short, almost clumsy message from one of my children. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was a start. A few sentences acknowledging the distance, asking if we might talk soon. I read it 3 times, unsure whether to believe it. After everything, could this be a genuine attempt to reach across the gap? Or just another trap leading back into old arguments? I held that letter in my hand longer than I care to admit, wrestling with the part of me that longed for reconciliation and the part that feared reopening scars. If I agreed to meet, would we sit at the table as family, or as enemies pretending to be polite? That tension carried me into the meeting itself. We chose a cafe neutral ground. I arrived early, sitting near the window, my hands folded tightly in my lap. When they walked in, I could see the hesitation in their face, as though they were unsure whether I'd even show up. We exchanged greetings, careful ones, and for a while we spoke about ordinary things, the weather, work, the food on the menu. But beneath that small talk sat the weight of everything left unsaid. Eventually it came out. They admitted that they had let anger guide them, that greed had twisted their judgment. I listened without interrupting, though my mind replayed every night I had sat awake wondering how my own child could turn against me. And then came the question, do you think we can ever come back from this? I didn't rush my answer, because the truth was, forgiveness isn't a single yes or no. It's a process, a choice made again and again. I told them I couldn't promise the past would vanish, but I could promise to keep showing up if they were willing to do the same. It wasn't dramatic. There were no tears, no embraces, just a nod and a shared understanding that this was a first step, not an ending. On the walk home, I felt something unexpected. Not joy, not even relief, but a lightness I hadn't carried in years. It was as though setting down my need for final closure gave me room to breathe again. I realized then that life doesn't wait for perfect reconciliation before moving forward. It asks only that you decide, each day, whether to hold on to bitterness or to make space for something else. The following weeks brought small changes. A phone call here, a shared meal there. Nothing dramatic, but enough to remind me that relationships aren't rebuilt in grand gestures. They're pieced together in moments, almost fragile in how ordinary they look. And maybe that was the lesson I needed most. Healing isn't loud. It's quiet. It doesn't demand attention. It grows in the background until one day you look around and realize the house doesn't feel as heavy as it once did. That doesn't mean the story is finished. There are still days when the memories sting, when I wonder why it had to unfold this way at all. But I've come to see those questions not as weights, but as reminders that I lived through something real. And surviving real pain gives you a kind of strength no one can take away. I used to think endings were neat. That one conversation, one handshake, one apology could tie everything together and put the past behind me. But living through this has taught me that endings aren't clean. They're layered, like pages in a book where the ink doesn't dry evenly. You turn a page and the words of the last chapter still smudge into the next. Even after our cautious attempts at reconnection, the echoes of betrayal didn't vanish overnight. They lived in the pauses of our phone calls, in the careful way we chose our words, as though each sentence might reopen a wound. I found myself weighing every interaction. Was this genuine progress, or just another fragile attempt waiting to snap? It reminded me that healing isn't a single event. It's a slow, often uncomfortable rhythm that you either learn to keep up with or fall behind. Some days I felt proud of how far we had come. Other days, the bitterness flared again when I remembered the nights I sat alone, doubting everything I had done for them. But I stopped expecting a final answer. Instead, I tried to see each small step as its own kind of victory. A call that didn't turn into an argument. A meal that ended in laughter, not slammed doors. These weren't dramatic moments, but they mattered. Friends would sometimes ask me why I even bothered. Why not cut ties completely and move on? I could never give a simple answer. Because the truth is, you don't stop being a parent just because your child hurts you. The bond may twist, it may even break, but a part of you still hopes for repair. I told them I wasn't chasing a perfect family picture anymore. I just wanted honesty. And if that honesty included admitting the damage, then so be it. One evening, sitting across from my child again, I noticed something I hadn't before. They weren't just uncomfortable with me, they were uncomfortable with themselves. It was in the way their eyes avoided mine when they talked about the choices they made, in the hesitation that lingered before they asked if I could ever trust them again. For the first time, I realized the betrayal hadn't only wounded me. It had wounded them too, though in a different way. That realization brought its own tension. Because recognizing their pain didn't erase mine, it complicated it. Part of me wanted to cling to anger, to keep the wall between us as protection. But another part saw a chance for something neither of us expected. Not reconciliation in the fairy tale sense, but an honest relationship shaped by survival, not illusion. And I had to decide, would I risk opening myself to that possibility, knowing it could collapse again? I thought about my own parents then, how they never apologized for the mistakes they made. I thought about the silence that lived in my childhood home, and how it shaped me for decades. Maybe breaking that cycle wasn't about winning arguments or being proven right. Maybe it was about sitting in the same room with someone who had hurt you and saying, "I'm still here. I'm not leaving, even if it's messy." The hardest part was accepting that trust would never return to what it once was. And maybe it shouldn't. Trust lost is like glass shattered. It can be glued back together, but the cracks always show. I stopped expecting to erase the cracks. Instead, I started treating them as reminders of what we'd survived. We didn't need to pretend the glass was flawless. We only needed to learn how to hold it carefully enough not to break it again. In the months that followed, I noticed changes not only in our relationship but in myself. I learned to pause before reacting, to let silence work for me instead of against me. I learned to accept apologies without demanding that they erase the past. And perhaps most importantly, I learned to stop measuring love by perfection. Love, I realized, is sometimes just the decision to stay at the table even when the food is cold. One night, we sat outside together, the kind of quiet evening that doesn't need filling. They said something simple that I'll never forget. "I know I can't undo it, but I don't want to keep living as if I didn't do it." That struck me. It wasn't about denial anymore. It was about ownership. And for the first time, I believed that maybe we were no longer circling the same wound. We were finally moving around it, learning how to carry it without letting it define us. There are still no guarantees. Tomorrow could bring another fight, another misunderstanding. But I no longer fear that possibility, because what I hold on to now isn't an image of what family is supposed to look like. It's the reality of what we're trying to build, cracks and all. And that feels more real than any picture-perfect ending I once imagined. When I look back, I see how every twist and turn in this fight wasn't just about paper, property, or who sat where at a table. It was about voice. It was about not letting years of work and sacrifice be erased by someone else's impatience. Many of you watching know exactly how that feels, when you've carried a family, but the same family starts treating you like you're in the way. Holding my ground wasn't easy, but it reminded me that dignity isn't something others hand to you. It's something you decide to keep, no matter who stands against you. And if you've ever wondered what happens when you take that stand one step further, when you don't just defend your place but reshape it entirely, you'll want to stay with me. Because the very next chapter takes that same defiance and turns it into something even sharper. Let's just say, when someone thought elders belonged in smaller corners, the answer I gave them was big enough to echo across every wall they thought I'd lost.